Mark Reynolds had a way of greeting mornings that most people had forgotten how to appreciate. A slow pour of coffee, the creak of his old porch chair, and a long look at the pine trees that rimmed the cul-de-sac. They stood like quiet sentinels, filtering the mist that drifted through the Oregon hills. It wasn't fancy living, just steady, predictable, and calm. After 35 years as a civil engineer for the county, Mark had earned his peace and his pension. He liked the sound of sprinklers ticking like metronomes, the faint bark of a neighbor's dog, and the rustle of newspapers being flung with lazy accuracy from a passing car. His yard was his pride. Not because it was perfect, but because it worked. Every rock, every plant had a purpose. The gentle slope at the back of his property was part of an old runoff channel from when the whole area was still farmland. Over the years, he'd shaped it into something beautiful and useful, a rain garden. It wasn't the manicured green carpet most of his neighbors preferred. It was a tapestry of native plants and small stones, the kind that soaked up rain instead of letting it flood the street. In summer, monarch butterflies hovered over the milkweed. In winter, the ground drank quietly, never pooling or spilling into the gutters like the other yards. He'd done it mostly out of habit, that engineer's itch to make things function just a little better. And maybe a bit because his late wife, Linda, used to call him the water whisperer. She'd tease him about his obsession with slope angles and runoff coefficients, but she loved the way their backyard shimmered with wildflowers after the rain. Now it was just him, the frogs, and the occasional neighbor's cat pretending to hunt them. That peace lasted 3 years, 3 entire years, until Carol decided to take office. Carol Jenkins, HOA president. A woman with the posture of a traffic cone and the enthusiasm of a motivational speaker who'd read only the table of contents. Her reign began with a promise of reinvigorating neighborhood standards. In practice, that meant a monthly newsletter packed with cheerful threats about mailbox colors and lawn heights. At first, Mark didn't pay much attention. He'd seen her type before. Bureaucrats without a bureau. She'd wave from her driveway, clipboard in hand, like a marshal in charge of a parade that didn't exist. Most neighbors just shrugged her off. But one morning, as Mark picked up his newspaper, he noticed a bright orange envelope taped to his mailbox. Notice of violation. It read in bold, unforgiving font. He thought it was a joke. Maybe Todd, the guy across the street, had finally gotten him back for the world's best engineer mug incident at the last block party. But no, the letter inside was real, printed on HOA letterhead and signed by none other than Carol herself. Dear Mr. Reynolds, it has come to our attention that your front yard contains non-conforming landscaping structures not consistent with approved community aesthetics. Please remove or submit a formal modification request within 14 days to avoid fines. He read it twice, then laughed out loud. Non-conforming structures. It was a rock bed and a few native ferns. He glanced over the garden. The small depression was doing its job, capturing a puddle of last night's drizzle. Frogs were chirping in gratitude. Guess you boys aren't up to code, he muttered. The next day, Carol appeared. She wore that HOA badge like a sheriff's star. Morning, Mark. Have you had a chance to read the letter? Sure did, he said, sipping his coffee. Fine piece of literature. It's just a friendly reminder. We've had complaints that your yard looks unkempt. Unkempt? Carol, I mow the grass more than you mow your husband's patience. She didn't laugh. There's standing water, Mark. That attracts mosquitoes. It's called a rain garden, he said evenly. It's designed to collect runoff and filter it naturally. Keeps the lower street from flooding. Well, if it's not in the approved landscaping handbook, it needs to go through proper review. He raised an eyebrow. You mean the same handbook that says we can't have garden gnomes taller than 12 inches? I'll have to check if my frogs got the memo. Her smile tightened like a belt. Just submit the modification form. It's standard procedure. When she left, Mark sat back down. He wasn't angry yet, just bemused. The absurdity of it tickled the engineer in him. He could measure rainfall to the millimeter, calculate runoff velocity in his head. But here he was arguing over puddles. Later that week, the HOA newsletter arrived in the mail. A front-page blurb read, Maintaining Uniform Beauty, the heart of green meadows. There was even a section titled Common Landscaping Violations. One photo looked suspiciously like his yard, cropped just enough to be deniable. He chuckled and folded it into a coaster. Still, the letters kept coming. One every few days, each more officious than the last. One claimed he'd failed to maintain consistent grass coverage. Another warned that unapproved flora may depreciate community value. He half expected the next one to accuse him of suspiciously photogenic rainfall. His daughter called from Seattle one evening, hearing the mild frustration in his voice. "Dad, you're not going to war with your HOA again, are you?" "Not yet," he said, "but I might start charging them consulting fees." She laughed. "Just don't build a moat." "Too late," he said, looking out at his drainage channel glistening under the porch light. By week 3, the situation had become neighborhood gossip. At the mailbox cluster, Mrs. Henderson whispered, "Carol's gunning for you, Mark. She says your garden's a swamp." "Good," he said with a smile. "Maybe it'll drown out her newsletter." A few neighbors were sympathetic. Others avoided eye contact, not wanting to be seen as associating. That was the strange power of HOAs. They turned grown adults into nervous teenagers. Mark decided to comply halfway. He submitted a modification request, stapling a photo of his rain garden to the form with a sticky note. "This is called hydrology. Please Google it." 2 days later, the form was returned, stamped denied. Reason: non-standard landscaping feature. He started to feel that slow burn of disbelief. How could common sense lose this badly? It wasn't even about the garden anymore, it was about the principle. He built things that kept communities standing. He'd literally engineered this neighborhood's original drainage plan decades ago. Now he was being fined for maintaining part of it. The absurdity was almost poetic. The man who understood the land better than anyone else was being told by a clipboard that nature was out of compliance. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Mark sat on his porch again, coffee in hand. The frogs were out, singing like they hadn't gotten the memo either. Across the street, Carol's sprinklers hissed uselessly against her perfectly even grass. He unfolded the latest letter, another violation notice, this time threatening corrective landscaping action by HOA contractors. He read it once, twice, then folded it neatly and set it beside his mug. "That letter," he said softly to no one, "changed everything." The first sign that things were about to get absurd came early one Tuesday morning, when Mark noticed a beige sedan parked halfway across his driveway. Inside sat Todd, the HOA's self-appointed compliance officer and resident hall monitor. Todd had once been a mall security guard and still wore that proud posture of authority without actual power. A pair of cheap binoculars rested on his dashboard like a badge. Mark stepped outside, coffee in hand, and waved. "Morning, Todd. You birdwatching? Or are the frogs back on the wanted list?" Todd rolled down his window, clipboard in hand. "Just conducting an inspection, Mark. HOA protocol. Nothing personal." "Protocol? You're parked on my property." Todd hesitated. "Technically, your driveway is visible from the street. That means it's under community jurisdiction." Mark smiled thinly. "That's creative. You write that yourself? Or is that in Carol's Bible of bylaws?" Todd didn't answer. He just scribbled something down and drove off, tires crunching over gravel. By noon, Mark received an email titled Second Violation Notice, Escalated Enforcement Pending. It listed infractions like unauthorized excavation, unapproved rock edging, and, his personal favorite, harboring invasive amphibian species. He laughed so hard coffee came out his nose. Frogs. They're after the frogs now. That night, he told his daughter about it over the phone. "They're acting like I'm running a reptile sanctuary." "Dad, you could always just fill it in," she suggested gently. "And let them win? Not a chance. Besides, this isn't just dirt. It's engineering. I built that system to prevent flooding down the slope. They bulldoze it. They'll regret it." His daughter sighed the way adult children do when they know their parents are right but wish they weren't about to prove it. "Just don't end up on the evening news." By the following weekend, the letters turned into fines. The first was for $100, followed by a second marked daily accrual notice. Apparently, each day the violation persisted, another $100 would pile up. Mark read it aloud to his porch light like a bedtime story. Once upon a time, an HOA thought it could outspend gravity. Neighbors began noticing the tension. Mrs. Henderson waved him over during her morning walk. "Mark, I saw Carol out front taking photos of your yard again. She was measuring something. You okay?" "Me? Fine. But I think she's starting to develop a deep emotional relationship with my drainage system." Henderson chuckled. "She told the board your garden was attracting wild animals." "Well," Mark said, glancing toward the bushes where a bunny hopped past, "she's half right." Across the street, Todd and Carol were conferring beside her SUV, gesturing toward his property like generals plotting a siege. He could almost hear them rehearsing lines from the HOA handbook for dramatic overreach. A few days later, a letter arrived marked final warning. In bold, it read, "Failure to remove non-conforming landscaping by Friday will result in corrective action taken by the HOA at homeowner's expense." Mark folded the paper carefully and set it beside the others. He had enough now to start a scrapbook titled The Chronicles of Common Sense versus Bureaucracy. That evening, his friend Larry stopped by, a retired firefighter who'd lived 2 houses down since the 80s. Larry looked over the yard, whistling. "You'd think they'd have bigger problems. Carol's husband's shed is halfway on the easement line." Mark smirked. "She enforces from the neck up, not the feet down." Larry chuckled, taking a sip of beer. "You gonna fight it?" "Not yet. Let them dig their own hole first. Literally, if we're lucky." On Thursday, a community email blast went out titled Neighborhood Beautification Day. It was Carol's proud idea. Everyone was encouraged to refresh their landscape with approved plants and uniform edging. Volunteers could even buy discounted turf squares through the HOA. Mark read the email twice and muttered, "A sale on conformity. Perfect." He didn't participate, but he watched from his porch as Carol supervised a small team of volunteers planting the same sterile shrubs in every yard like corporate clones. They looked like green cubes in a sea of mulch. When one of them pointed toward Mark's house, Carol put her hands on her hips. He could tell she was giving her speech, community standards, aesthetic cohesion, all that. Later that evening, he walked over to inspect one of the beautification plots. The plastic turf was shiny under the porch lights, too shiny. He leaned down and pressed a finger against it, hot to the touch. It was melting slightly under the summer heat. "Well," he murmured, "at least my garden's real." The next morning, the orange envelope was back, fluttering on his mailbox like a warning flag. But this time it wasn't just a letter. A bright yellow sticky note was attached in Carol's handwriting. "We will be resolving this matter directly if you refuse to comply." He knew what that meant. 2 days later, he packed a small overnight bag, heading to Seattle for the weekend to visit his daughter. Before leaving, he took a slow walk around his property. The stones were neat, the plants trimmed, and the little basin sat still and patient, ready for rain. He knelt to touch the soil. "Keep things steady while I'm gone," he said softly, more to himself than the garden. He drove off just before dawn, radio humming, leaving behind the quiet sound of sprinklers. When he returned on Monday evening, something felt wrong the moment he turned onto his street. The air smelled like raw dirt. His driveway was streaked with mud tracks. And where his rain garden had been, the carefully balanced heart of his yard, there was now just flat, compacted earth. The stones were gone, the plants ripped out, the basin filled in. In their place was a slab of sod so bright and fake it looked like someone had glued green carpet to the ground. He stood there for a long time, jaw tight, coffee thermos still in hand. A small white flag flapped from the center of the new turf, staked proudly into the soil. It read, "Property brought to compliance by Green Meadows HOA." For a moment, he thought maybe it was a dream, some bizarre comedy sketch where the punchline hadn't landed yet. Then he noticed the gouge marks on the curb where a small bulldozer had turned. They'd actually done it. Todd's beige sedan rolled by slowly. The window slid down. "Hey, Mark," he said nervously. Board voted unanimously. "It's nothing personal." Mark stared at him. "Todd, you realize that wasn't just a garden, right? It was part of the runoff system." Todd shrugged. "All I know is Carol said it violated code. Looks better now, doesn't it?" "Depends," Mark said quietly. "You like swimming?" Todd blinked. "Huh. Never mind. You'll find out." He walked back to his porch, every step heavy but calm. There was no shouting, no scene. Just the slow realization that something much bigger had just been set in motion, and not by him. He sat down, staring at the flattened patch of lifeless sod. A frog hopped weakly across it, searching for water that was no longer there. "Sorry, buddy," Mark murmured. "Looks like they drained us both." The neighborhood around him buzzed with normalcy. Sprinklers ticking, cars humming, kids riding bikes. But beneath it, he could feel something subtle shifting. The ground, maybe. The balance. From his porch, he could see Carol's pristine yard across the street. She was already admiring her handiwork, sipping iced tea like a general surveying conquered land. Mark sipped his cold coffee, eyes steady, voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have touched it." And somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, soft, low, and promising. The next morning, the sky was still bruised with gray clouds, the kind that promised rain but hadn't yet decided when to deliver. Mark stood by the window, coffee steaming in his hand, staring out at the flat patch of fake green that had replaced his life's quiet masterpiece. The air smelled sterile now, plastic and fertilizer instead of damp soil and minty native leaves. Every time the wind blew, the sod rippled slightly, like it was already trying to escape the earth it didn't belong to. He wasn't angry, not in the way people expected. Anger was loud, unfocused. He'd been around long enough to know that fury wasted energy better spent on precision. What he felt was something colder, more measured. A quiet, clean determination that made him breathe slower and think sharper. He set his mug down, opened the hall closet, and pulled out a worn banker's box labeled Work Archives. Inside were neatly stacked folders, engineering blueprints, and old county project binders. He hadn't looked at them in years, but he knew exactly what he was searching for. A label in faded ink read Green Meadows Subdivision. Stormwater Layout, 1998. His signature sat in the corner of the cover sheet, just as neat and crisp as the day he signed it. He smiled faintly. Well, he murmured. "Would you look at that?" He spread the plans across his kitchen table. The paper smelled faintly of dust and ink. Every cul-de-sac, every drain line, every slope contour was mapped precisely. He traced a finger along the small retention basin at the southern edge of the hill, right behind his property line. The blue markings denoted its purpose. Primary overflow mitigation basin, privately maintained under county approval. He laughed once, short and sharp. Privately maintained. That'd be me. Back then, when the neighborhood was still in development, Mark had been part of the county's engineering team. The builder had asked him to design a runoff system that blended with the landscape instead of relying on concrete channels. He'd proposed a natural filtration basin, what would later become his personal rain garden. It wasn't just pretty. It prevented flooding for the lower half of the neighborhood, including Carol's perfect little kingdom of hydrangeas. The irony was almost too poetic. The HOA had bulldozed their own safety net. He took photos of the old plans with his phone, then went outside. The ground was already showing signs of strain. Without the basin, water was pooling along the fence line after each sprinkle, small channels cutting through the new sod. He knelt, pressing a hand to the dirt. It was slick, loose, and heavy, the kind of soil that didn't take kindly to arrogance. "Patience, old friend," he muttered to the earth. "They'll learn." Back inside, he composed an email, not to the HOA, not to Carol, but to the county's stormwater compliance office. The subject line was simple: destruction of approved drainage structure, Green Meadows HOA violation. He attached copies of his old stamped blueprints, photos of the bulldozed area, and a detailed note explaining how the HOA had removed a certified mitigation basin without county authorization. He didn't exaggerate or editorialize. Engineers don't rant. They document. Before hitting send, he reread it aloud. Calm. Factual. Bulletproof. He clicked send. Then he poured another cup of coffee and sat on his porch like nothing happened. Later that day, Carol stopped by, clipboard tucked under her arm, smug as ever. Good afternoon, Mark. The board just wanted to thank you for your cooperation. Your property looks so much cleaner now. You'll start receiving notice of fine removal soon. He smiled politely. Glad to hear it, Carol. I actually just sent an email to the county about the drainage structure you had removed. Her smile faltered slightly. Drainage structure? Yes, he said, tone easy. That non-conforming landscaping feature you bulldozed was part of the subdivision's certified runoff control plan, approved by the county back in '98. You remember the rain last spring that didn't flood anyone's yard? That was because of it. She blinked, lips parting just enough to betray the first flicker of doubt. I wasn't aware of that. Well, Mark said, sipping his coffee, you are now, and so is the county. For a second, she looked like she wanted to argue, but her clipboard dropped slightly, and she turned on her heel with a stiff, have a nice day. Mark watched her go, expression unreadable. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was the loudest weapon. That evening, the wind picked up again, and the first heavy raindrops began to patter against his window. The smell of petrichor returned, faint but familiar. He stood on the porch, watching small streams snake down the street. The water moved differently now, faster, less controlled. It gathered near driveways, pooled at curbs, and lingered in spots that used to drain cleanly. The land, he realized, was already telling the story. All he had to do was wait for the next chapter. 2 days later, an email arrived from the county's compliance officer, a woman named Sandra. Mr. Reynolds, thank you for your report and documentation. Based on the evidence provided, it appears the HOA performed unauthorized modification to an engineered stormwater facility. We will be inspecting the site this week and may issue a notice of violation. Please refrain from additional alterations until the investigation concludes. Mark read it 3 times, then leaned back in his chair. Beautiful, he said softly. Let the professionals handle the grading. He printed the email and pinned it to his refrigerator under a magnet shaped like a frog. Over the next few days, he noticed small signs of trouble brewing. Carol's driveway began showing water stains that hadn't been there before. Todd's yard, 1 house downhill, was spongy underfoot. One afternoon, Todd came by while Mark was coiling his garden hose. Hey, you ever notice water pooling more lately? Todd asked. Mark shrugged. Oh, I wouldn't know. My drainage feature was removed. Todd frowned. Well, Carol says it's just because the ground's saturated. She's gonna call a landscaper. Sure, Mark said. Maybe ask for one that floats. Todd gave him a confused look and walked away. That night, Mark dug small, discreet trenches along his back fence. Not deep, just enough to divert water away from his foundation. He wasn't doing it out of spite. He was doing it because, well, that's what engineers do. You don't stand in the way of physics. You just guide it. The next morning, dark clouds rolled over the hills like slow smoke. The air was thick and still. He checked the weather report. Heavy rain, possible flooding in lower elevation areas. He chuckled. Lower elevations, that would be Carol and Todd. He made sure his gutters were clear, checked the slope of his trenches, and went inside to make a fresh pot of coffee. He wasn't eager for chaos, but he couldn't help a certain curiosity. It wasn't revenge he wanted. It was proof. Proof that common sense had a way of surfacing when arrogance washed away. By noon, the rain started. Fat drops, steady and heavy, thudding on rooftops and rolling down gutters. The sound was hypnotic. Mark sat by the window, watching water flow naturally down the street. First, everything seemed fine. Then the puddles began to merge. He saw it in slow motion, the slope that used to absorb rainfall now gleaming with runoff. The sod Carol had proudly laid was slick and unstable, sliding slightly toward the curb. Water poured across Todd's driveway like a lazy stream. Mark stayed quiet, simply taking notes. Old habits die hard. By evening, the rain intensified, hammering the windows and flooding the gutters. Lights flickered. Somewhere down the block, a car alarm wailed. And through the roar of the storm, Mark could almost hear his late wife's voice, half amused, half proud. "You always said people underestimate gravity." He smiled, murmuring to himself, "They're about to learn." By midnight, the rain was relentless. The slope behind the houses looked like it was exhaling. Softly, slowly, dangerously. Mark stood by the porch light, watching rivulets of water carve new paths through the soil. His small trenches guided the flow safely past his property line. But below, the lawns of the self-proclaimed enforcers shimmered with pooled water, edges sagging. He didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. He just whispered, "You really shouldn't have touched it." Somewhere in the distance, thunder cracked again. Closer this time, sharp and decisive. It sounded, to Mark, almost like applause. By dawn, the storm had gone from dramatic to biblical. The gutters were roaring, and every downspout in the neighborhood was vomiting brown water into the streets. Mark had barely slept. Not because he was worried, but because he wanted to watch. There was a strange calm to him, like an engineer observing an experiment he already knew the outcome of. Coffee mug in hand, he stood on the porch, wrapped in an old flannel, watching gravity reclaim its power. The street looked like a shallow river, glistening under the gray sky. Plastic flower pots, mulch, and one unfortunate lawn gnome bobbed past like casualties of a suburban flood. A few houses down, Todd was out in his bathrobe, waving a broom at the current as if he could sweep the water back uphill. "Morning, Todd," Mark called out over the wind. "Beautiful day for ducks." Todd looked up, wild-eyed. "It's everywhere, man. My backyard's underwater." "Yeah," Mark said, sipping his coffee. "Looks like your drainage system isn't up to code." Todd blinked, mouth opening, but before he could reply, a loud crack split the air. A wooden fence panel down the slope tilted forward, roots and soil giving way beneath it. The whole section slumped into a muddy slide that oozed toward Carol's yard. And that's when the real chaos began. Carol's voice carried even over the rain, sharp, frantic, and unmistakable. She burst out onto her porch wearing a neon pink raincoat and clutching her phone. "Todd, call the HOA emergency line. The retaining wall is collapsing." Mark couldn't help but admire the irony. The HOA's emergency line was just Todd's phone. Todd looked at her, then at the crumbling yard, then at his soaked slippers. "I think it's a little late for that." Carol slipped, catching herself on a porch post as a section of her immaculate lawn started to slump downward, forming a shallow pool where the grass bubbled with runoff. Her once-perfect hydrangeas floated like small blue lifeboats. From his porch, Mark could see water cascading from 3 different directions. Without the rain garden to catch and slow it, every drop was now free to follow the slope downhill. It didn't just look bad, it looked inevitable. Across the street, neighbors were filming. Someone had already gone live on Facebook. "Green Meadows turns into Green Rapids." A woman narrated over the video. "This is what happens when you pick a fight with Mother Nature." "Oh, there goes the HOA president's fence." Another fence post snapped, and Carol screamed as it toppled, narrowly missing her flower bed. Todd was trying to dig a shallow trench with a garden spade, but the mud clung to his boots, pulling him down like the world's slowest quicksand. Mark leaned against his porch column, half concerned, half entertained. "Maybe they'll fine the rain for not following landscaping guidelines," he muttered. The rain intensified, pounding against the roof like applause. He could feel the earth trembling slightly beneath the saturation. Water has a way of remembering where it used to go, and without his garden's guidance, it had rediscovered its old path. Straight downhill, right under Carol's deck. An hour later, the county truck arrived. Bright orange vests, mud-splattered boots, and a lot of pointing. One of the inspectors, a woman named Sandra, the same name from his email, walked the slope with careful steps, clipboard held high. Mark watched her crouch near the flattened area where his garden used to be, tracing a finger along the edge of what used to be the basin's contour. He went out to meet her, raincoat zipped halfway up. "Morning. Didn't think you'd make it in this weather." Sandra straightened, rain dripping off her hard hat. "We couldn't wait. We've got reports of flooding all through this subdivision." "You're Mr. Reynolds." "That's me." She nodded toward the downhill chaos. "I think I can already guess what happened here. The HOA removed your mitigation basin, without permit or consultation, bulldozed it clean." Sandra exhaled through her nose, professional but clearly annoyed. "That explains the slope failure. You had it perfectly placed. Once they took that out, the water had nowhere to go but through them." "Nature's an efficient auditor," Mark said dryly. She chuckled. "We'll be issuing a formal notice of violation. I'll need to take a few photos." As she walked off, Mark spotted Carol marching toward them through the mud, raincoat now speckled brown. "Excuse me," she shouted, waving her clipboard like a white flag. "This entire situation is due to unapproved alterations on his property. He destroyed community landscaping." Sandra turned to her, voice calm. "Ma'am, our records show Mr. Reynolds' drainage feature was part of the original county-approved plan. Removing it without authorization is a code violation under Section 14.3. You'll need to contact your insurance." Carol froze, mouth open, raindrops streaking her mascara. "Insurance? You mean we have to pay for this?" "That's generally how liability works," Sandra said, "especially when gravity's involved." For a second, there was silence, just rain, wind, and the faint croak of a surviving frog somewhere nearby. Then Carol snapped, spinning toward Mark. "You did this on purpose." He raised an eyebrow. "I did try to warn you. Multiple times, in writing even." "You," she sputtered, but Sandra interrupted gently. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to step away from the slope. It's still unstable." Carol stumbled back, muttering something about lawyers and unacceptable behavior. Todd appeared beside her, covered in mud up to his knees, clutching a shovel like a defeated soldier. Carol, the garage is flooding." Her eyes widened in horror. "What?" Mark almost felt bad for her. Almost. As the inspectors wrapped up, a local news van rolled in. The driver splashed through ankle-deep puddles, cameraman already filming. The side of the van read Channel 8, Your Neighborhood News. A young reporter in a bright yellow poncho hopped out and called, "Anyone willing to talk about the flood?" Mark smiled faintly and raised a hand. "Sure. I can explain what happens when you mistake landscaping for hydrology." The segment aired that evening under the headline "Oregon Neighborhood Faces Flood After HOA Landscaping Project Goes Wrong." The footage showed Mark calmly explaining runoff management while Carol stood in the background waving her arms, trying to keep a blue tarp from flying away. The internet did what it always does. It turned the clip into a meme. By midnight, the rain finally eased. The damage, however, was done. 3 yards had lost major chunks of soil. 2 fences had collapsed. Carol's basement was officially indoor pool adjacent. And Todd's driveway had developed a small crack that looked suspiciously like the beginning of a slide. Mark went to bed late, listening to the faint dripping from his gutters, the rhythmic tick of rain easing off the roof. He slept soundly, knowing the county would handle the rest. The next morning, the sun returned, muted, pale, and merciful. Steam rose from the soaked asphalt. The cul-de-sac looked like a battlefield after the rain's retreat. Mud streaks across lawns, toppled trash bins. A lone plastic flamingo washed up against a mailbox. Mark poured his coffee and opened his email. There it was, County Stormwater Compliance Violation issued to Green Meadows HOA. He scrolled through the document. Technical language, photos, timestamps. A formal citation for unauthorized modification of engineered infrastructure, subject to penalties and remediation costs. He chuckled. Paperwork justice. My favorite kind. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Carol and Todd standing there, looking like 2 soaked cats who'd lost their fight with the garden hose. "Mark, Carol began, her tone sugar with a hint of salt. "We're looking for a way to resolve this. Quietly." "Quietly?" he repeated. "Like the way you bulldozed it while I was out of town?" Her face flushed. "That was a misunderstanding. Maybe you could retract your complaint? We'll cover the repairs to your yard." He leaned against the doorframe, considering. "It's not my yard you should worry about. It's the hill." Carol blinked. "The hill?" "Yeah," he said with a small smile. "The one holding up your property." For a moment no one spoke. A distant rumble of thunder rolled lazily over the hills again, soft but deliberate. Mark stepped back inside, leaving them on the porch. "Oh, and Carol?" he called over his shoulder. "Next time you want to modify an engineer's work, maybe ask for the blueprints first." As he closed the door, the faint croak of frogs echoed from somewhere near the fence, like applause rising from the mud. And that was when he decided it was time to let the rest of the world in on the story. "At this point," he said later in his retelling voiceover tone, "I've got to ask, have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Drop your story in the comments, hit subscribe if you love poetic justice, and let's see how many of us have survived HOA brutality." Then, after a breath, he'd go back to the story, because nature wasn't finished proving her point yet. The county's notice was only the beginning. The next rainstorm would make sure of that. The county inspector's report hit the HOA like a thunderclap the following week. Mark didn't have to hear it to know. He could feel the tension humming across the neighborhood like static in humid air. Cars came and went from Carol's driveway all day, each one carrying a new face. Contractors, adjusters, someone in a suit who looked like a lawyer trying not to step in the mud. From his porch, Mark sipped coffee and observed with detached calm, the same way he used to watch concrete cure. Slowly, inevitably, the HOA sent out an emergency email that night: community update, stormwater incident, and remediation plan. It was full of corporate phrases like unexpected slope destabilization, unforeseen hydrological complications, and temporary assessment required for neighborhood safety improvements. The translation was clear. They'd broken it, and now everyone was paying for it. The temporary assessment turned out to be anything but small. $75,000 spread across 32 homes. Each property, except Mark's, was billed for repairs to restore the drainage basin the HOA had destroyed. The email claimed Mark was exempt due to previous compliance with original hydrology plan. Someone must have fought to include that sentence, because the tone practically oozed resentment. By morning, the gossip engine was roaring. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for weeks suddenly waved again. Mrs. Henderson came by with a plate of cookies and whispered, "I knew you'd come out on top, Mark. Carol's been hiding in her house all day." He smiled politely. "It's not about winning, Helen. It's about physics." She chuckled. "Well, physics sure handed out some justice this time." Later that afternoon, he got an official copy of the violation letter from the county. He read every line slowly, savoring the bureaucratic poetry. Unauthorized destruction of engineered runoff mitigation system, failure to maintain slope stability, civil liability under Section 14.3. It was the language of accountability, the kind of quiet revenge no raised voice could ever achieve. That evening, as if scripted by irony itself, Carol called an urgent community meeting. Mark went, partly out of curiosity, partly to enjoy the free donuts she always brought to soften bad news. The clubhouse smelled like wet carpet and embarrassment. Folding chairs scraped the floor as homeowners filed in, clutching printouts of the letter. Carol stood at the front, flanked by Todd and another board member. Her hair was perfectly combed, her voice tight but rehearsed. "As you all know, the recent storm caused damage due to a combination of factors outside our control. The county has unfortunately decided to—" "Unfortunately?" a neighbor interrupted. "You bulldozed the drainage system." Carol blinked. "We acted under the understanding that—" Another voice cut her off. "You acted like you were in charge of civil engineering, Carol." The room murmured, building like thunder again. Mark leaned back in his chair, watching it unfold. It was strange. Satisfying, yes, but also a little sad. He never wanted chaos, he just wanted reason to win for once. Carol tried to regain control. Please, let's stay civil. We all want the same thing. Yeah, said Larry from the back. Dry basements. The laughter that followed was the polite kind that masks years of irritation finally cracking open. Carol cleared her throat, scanning the crowd for an ally. We need volunteers to form a committee to coordinate with the county on remediation efforts. Why don't we just ask Mark? Someone said loudly. Heads turned toward him. Mark smiled faintly, shaking his head. I'm retired. I try to avoid committees that start with apologies. A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Even Todd cracked a reluctant grin. Carol's composure wavered. Mr. Reynolds, given your professional background, perhaps you could advise the board? He pretended to think about it. Only if I get full autonomy over my property's runoff control. There was a pause. Then, surprisingly, she nodded. Approved. And just like that, the neighborhood's quiet rebellion turned official. Over the next month, contractors arrived to rebuild what had been destroyed. But this time, under county supervision and with Mark's input. The new basin was larger, reinforced, and integrated with additional runoff channels that improved flow for half the street. Every morning, he'd stand outside giving simple directions while the crew worked. Todd stopped by one afternoon holding 2 coffees. Didn't think I'd ever see you back in hard hat mode. Mark smiled, taking the cup. Hydrology doesn't retire. It just waits for amateurs to mess things up. They laughed, and for the first time there was no edge between them. Meanwhile, Carol was noticeably quieter. The HOA newsletters had gone from cheerful propaganda to terse bulletins about ongoing infrastructure updates. Rumor had it she'd stepped down as president for health reasons. Though Mark suspected the illness was more reputational than physical. When the project was finally finished, the county hosted a small walkthrough inspection. Sandra, the compliance officer, shook Mark's hand. You did good work here, Mr. Reynolds. I hope the HOA learned its lesson. They did, he said with a small smile. Gravity's the best teacher. She laughed. I'll remember that. The new rain garden was more beautiful than before. 2 tiers of native plants, river stones arranged like gentle spirals, and a discreet county sign posted on a stake. Protected stormwater facility. Do not disturb, by order of County Code 14.3. It was a bureaucrat's way of saying hands off, and Mark loved it. He added one personal touch. A small wooden frog statue placed right in the center. It wasn't fancy, just something he carved himself from cedar. The neighbors called it the Guardian. Even kids started visiting after school to watch the water trickle through the basin, tossing pebbles and laughing. What had once been an HOA crime scene was now the neighborhood's unofficial park. And poetic justice didn't stop there. A month later, a heavy rainstorm returned. The kind that used to make Mark tense up instinctively. This time, he sat on his porch with a calm grin, watching the water flow perfectly into the new system. The garden filled gracefully, overflowing exactly as designed, the runoff channeling cleanly into the lower culvert. Not a drop reached the street. Across the way, Carol's replacement fence sagged slightly again, leaning toward him like a guilty apology. She came out briefly to inspect it, caught his eye, and gave the smallest of nods. Not friendly, not hostile, but somewhere in between acknowledgement and surrender. He raised his coffee cup in reply. After the rain eased, Mark walked down the hill to check the neighborhood. The new system had done its job. No flooding, no pooling, not even a muddy shoe print where the trouble used to start. It was flawless. At the base of the slope, Todd waved from his driveway. I'll say it, man, you were right. Mark shrugged. It's not about being right. It's about understanding what happens when you move the wrong rock. Todd laughed. You should teach a class. Already did, Mark said, glancing toward Carol's house. Enrollment was mandatory. That night, the air smelled like clean rain again, the way it used to before all the nonsense started. The frogs had returned, their chorus low and steady. He sat under the porch light, watching droplets slide down the leaves of his rebuilt garden. Each one found its way perfectly to the basin, like a system remembering its rhythm. He thought about Linda then, his wife, who used to say, "You can't stop the rain, but you can decide where it goes." She'd have enjoyed this whole ordeal. Not the fight itself, but the poetic symmetry of it all. He smiled softly. "You were right again, love." He stood, stretching his back, and looked out over the quiet, humbled neighborhood. Even the houses seemed to breathe easier now, the lawns freshly green, the roads clean of mud. As he turned to go inside, he caught a glimpse of the county's warning sign gleaming in the porch light. A permanent badge of vindication. "Funny thing about water," he murmured, closing the door behind him. "It always finds the lowest point, and sometimes so do people." Behind him, thunder rumbled far off in the hills. Not threatening this time, just a distant echo of everything that had settled. The neighborhood had found its balance again. Justice, Mark thought, didn't always arrive with noise and fury. Sometimes it came in paperwork, erosion, and one perfect sign that said, "Do not disturb." By spring, the neighborhood looked almost new again. The lawns had recovered, the roads were repaved, and the air smelled like wet cedar instead of mildew and regret. Mark's rain garden, now twice as large and protected by both county code and common sense, had become a quiet landmark. People slowed down when they passed it, not to complain anymore but to admire. It wasn't flashy. It didn't shout for attention. It just worked, the way good things are supposed to. Most mornings began the same as before all the nonsense. Coffee steaming on the porch, birds gossiping in the pine trees, frogs croaking softly near the basin. But there was a subtle shift in how the neighborhood felt. The air carried a little more humility, as if the whole cul-de-sac had taken a collective deep breath after a year of holding it in. The HOA, now under new leadership, was different too. The newsletters still arrived, but they'd been rewritten with a touch of self-awareness. Gone were the scolding paragraphs about mailbox paint and unauthorized flora. Instead, they started with things like, "Community tip. Native plants reduce water waste and prevent erosion. Thank you to Mr. Reynolds for helping us partner with the county on sustainability." Mark had to laugh the first time he read one. He pinned it on the fridge next to a photo of Linda, muttering, "Well, would you look at that?" They finally discovered science. The new HOA president, Linda from Unit 14, a coincidence that always made him smile, was younger, more practical, and didn't treat neighborhood management like a political campaign. She'd stopped by often during the restoration phase, asking questions and actually listening. One afternoon, she came by again, holding a clipboard, not as a weapon, but as a peace offering. "Hey Mark, mind if I ask you something?" "Sure," he said, setting down his trowel. "We're updating the HOA's community maintenance guide. I wanted to include a section on proper drainage and maybe some advice on native planting. Would you want to review it before we send it out?" He smiled. "So you want me to bless the gospel this time?" She laughed. "Something like that." He read through her notes later that night. It was simple stuff, nothing fancy. Keep gutters clear. Avoid impervious materials. Use native plants. Respect runoff flow. The kind of logic that didn't need an engineering degree to understand, just a bit of common sense. He made a few small corrections and wrote one sentence at the end in his neat, steady handwriting. "When in doubt, work with the land, not against it." That line became the HOA's new motto. It was funny, he thought, how time and irony worked together. The same board that once fined him for unauthorized landscaping was now using his design as their community model. The county even invited him to speak at a local sustainability seminar. He didn't accept. Public speaking wasn't his thing, but he sent along photos of his garden and a short note that simply read, "Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is nothing at all." The message got around. Other neighborhoods in the county began adding rain gardens of their own. The local paper ran a small feature titled, "The Man Who Let the Rain Win." Mark found that headline particularly funny. Despite the new calm, he never lost his morning ritual of quiet observation. Every drizzle, every puddle, every shift in the soil still fascinated him. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was something deeper, the satisfaction of knowing that patience, not pride, had won. Sometimes Todd would come by on his walks, now with a thermos of his own. The two men had developed an odd sort of friendship, forged not through shared hobbies but through shared lessons. "You ever think about how small that first letter was?" Todd said one morning, watching water trickle into the basin. "All this started with a paragraph on orange paper." Mark chuckled. "Funny how bureaucracy breeds disaster faster than rain ever could." Todd shook his head. "Carol would have a fit if she saw how much everyone loves this garden now." Mark smiled. "She drives by sometimes. Pretends she's looking at the mailboxes." They both laughed, and for a long moment, the only sound was the steady drip of runoff finding its path. A few houses down, kids were racing their bikes through the puddles, the same kind of harmless mischief that used to earn warning letters under Carol's rule. Their parents didn't stop them this time. They just watched, smiling, knowing the street would dry faster now anyway. That night, as the sunset turned the wet pavement gold, Mark sat on his porch and thought about everything that had happened. The letters, the fines, the bulldozer, the storm, the fallout, the rebuilding, all of it could have been just another petty HOA story, another tale of control gone wrong. But somehow it had become something better. A quiet reminder that competence, patience, and a little humor still meant something. He found himself thinking of Linda again, his Linda, not the new president. She used to tell him, "You're too calm for your own good." He'd always answer, "Someone's got to balance out the loud ones." She would have laughed herself breathless over this whole saga. He imagined her voice in his head, gentle but teasing. "So, what's the moral this time, Professor Reynolds?" He thought about it a long moment before answering softly, "That sometimes, the best revenge is proving you were right without saying a word." A frog croaked nearby like it agreed. Over the next few weeks, things settled fully into their new normal. The HOA held their annual barbecue on the newly repaired community lawn. Mark went mostly to be polite and found himself treated like a local celebrity. People kept stopping to shake his hand, thank him, ask advice. Someone joked about nominating him for the next HOA president election. He declined before they could finish the sentence. As dusk fell, someone turned on the string lights, and laughter rippled through the group. The air smelled like grilled corn and charcoal, that nostalgic, wholesome scent of neighborhood peace restored. Carol showed up late. She looked different, softer somehow, less tightly wound. She came over with a hesitant smile. "Mark," she said, "I just wanted to say, you were right, about the garden, about everything." He nodded politely. "Appreciate that." She lingered a moment, then added quietly, "I didn't mean for things to go that far. I really thought I was protecting the neighborhood." He studied her for a moment and then said gently, "We all tell ourselves that, Carol. The trick is learning when to stop protecting and start understanding." She gave a small nod, as if that was enough. Then she wandered off to help serve lemonade, and Mark realized he didn't feel any bitterness anymore. Just a strange, even warmth, the kind that comes after a long storm finally clears. Later that night, as the barbecue wound down and people drifted home, he stood by his garden one last time under the stars. The basin glistened in the moonlight, full from the sprinkler's runoff. The wooden frog sat proudly in the center, its reflection rippling softly on the surface. He bent down, touching the cool edge of a stone. "You did good, old friend," he whispered. "Kept your promise." When he stood, the wind carried the faint scent of rain. Distant, not threatening, just a reminder that it was always out there somewhere, waiting. He smiled, slipping his hands into his pockets, and started back toward the porch. As he reached the steps, he turned back once more and said quietly, almost to himself, "So if your HOA ever sends you a letter like mine, remember, you can't control the petty, but you can outsmart it." The porch light flicked on automatically, bathing him in a warm glow. Somewhere in the distance, a frog croaked again. Steady, confident, perfectly timed. And in that moment, surrounded by the peace he'd earned and the quiet justice he'd built with his own hands, Mark Reynolds felt exactly what every homeowner dreams of in the end. Balance. Not just in the soil, in the story, too. The rain garden shimmered gently under the night sky, patient and perfect, a living monument to common sense, calm revenge, and the simple truth that gravity, like karma, always finds its way home.